much. Welcome to the session on using analysis to help improve resource allocations. So my name is Maya King. I'm a lecturer in economics in the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. I'm also another of the CAPE alumni, so I'm also a research associate at ODI. And a project I'm working on at the moment is about the recent history of spending control in the UK Treasury, so since the early 90s. I think there's a lot of interesting parallels here. So we're used to thinking about allocation as one of the three objectives of PFM, and we probably can also all think of bad examples of misallocation, so teachers without textbooks, capital expenditure without maintenance, and clinics without drugs. So in this session we want to talk about analysis as a tool to try and tackle some of those issues. But the idea is to also think about that combination of allocation and analysis as a way that we can make connections between sector ministries and finance ministries in some of the issues we've been discussing in the previous session, and also to connect between the technical side of these issues and the political issues. So that's the challenge that we're going to set our speakers. And also I want to set the other challenge that I thought came out of the previous session, which is in what cases do finance ministries, should they do more, and in what cases should they do less? So that's one of the challenges I want to set us. So we've got four excellent speakers to look at these issues. Our first speaker today is Andrew Blasey, who is Deputy Head of PFM and Budgeting at the OECD's Public Governments Directorate, and prior to that he was the Budget Director of the New Zealand Treasury. Then we have Segai Tekleselassie, who is a Senior Researcher at the Policy Studies Institute in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and he coordinates the Human Development and Labour Studies Research Centre at PSI and has recently been involved in supporting the Ministry of Finance conduct a value for money study in the health sector. Then we have Kenneth Mugambe, who is Director of Budget in Uganda's Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, and he's been working in that post for 7 years, so he's going to bring that perspective to us. And then we have Paolo Durenzio, who's our discussant, and I'm particularly grateful to Paolo for stepping in at the last minute for Fiona Davies.
I'm not Fiona Davies.
Who was unable to make it due to a footballing injury, apparently. So Paolo is a Senior Research Fellow at the International Budget Partnership and is also a Research Associate at ODI. So back to Andrew, and if you can kick us off, please. And you all have 10 minutes to speak. Thank you.
Right. Okay, I'm on the clock. Well, thank you. It's a delight to be here. It's my first time to come along to this conference, and everyone who I spoke to would say, you must go to these. They're good fun. And so with that kind of recommendation, it's even more a pleasure to be here. OECD and coming along to ODI, I was sort of intimidated by being here in your presence because was mindful that our membership is quite different from the countries that ODI work with, and so therefore there will be limitations around some of the examples that I might identify, and but how there is a common dynamic, if you like, of learning from practices and recognising that there is no one solution to some of these challenges, and that's certainly no different with the 36 members of the OECD. 36, Lithuania joined in 2018. We've all got all but two more members in terms of Colombia and Costa Rica, who are in the final stages of joining as well. And probably for my own time and the team that I work with, half of that is with non-OECD countries, where the question we're asked the most is, for the level of development or economic wealth that country A is at, what were OECD countries doing at that stage of development in their path? And can you backdate some of those experiences or look at some of the maturity effects that have occurred in the path of OECD countries? I wish it was always that simple. The question's nice and simple, but haven't always found that the answers are certainly not yet. So a lot of the work too is on a regional basis, and I suppose the regions we work most with are with Asia, Central Europe and Latin America, reflecting really where our members have relations with non-members. And again, that tends to be a way of bringing people together. I say all this on purpose because I was at an event similar to this a while ago, and someone in question time said to me, "Yes, that's very nice, but what is the OECD?" And I realised, well, I should make a start by at least introducing and not assuming that people know what the OECD is. So analysis and the allocation of resources. I really liked the intro brief in the booklet in terms of distinguishing between a budget and between spending reviews in terms of two devices, one looking at the margin obviously and the other looking at the base. But what really that I liked about that was both political events as well as technical events. They are political events, and so in one sense, the budget will never go away. It's the most effective way of a government communicating its priorities. It's probably the only device of government that touches every part of government once a year. Some cabinet ministers don't even meet once a year, but they do get a budget, and that's pretty remarkable as a tool of government and how it's used. But in terms of whether it achieves allocative efficiency for resources is, I think, a really interesting challenge from a question in this morning's session, because it gave me pause for thought about the fact that it's time constrained. So there's not actually a lot of time to do in-depth analysis in the period of the budget cycle. Often the capacity constraints are high in the Ministry of Finance, let alone the line ministry that might be submitting the spending proposal. There can often be a mismatch in the requirements between, say, a capital expenditure item and a current expenditure item, where one's had to go through a lengthy period of business cases and an assessment, and the other one's just had a junior analyst write it up in the 2 months before it was due for the deadline for the budget cycle. I'm being a little bit flippant, but there is definitely, I think, a difference in treatment. So does that achieve efficiency? I think it achieves it where there is an excess of expenditure proposals relative to the resources available. Because at that point there's a competition, at that point there is some assessment whether it's at the technical level of a cost-benefit analysis or some form of review, but also at a political level around what is the government's priority. And that brings, in of itself, different dimensions there of how that critique is occurring. What we're seeing across the OECD countries, though, is a lot of focus on outcomes as an organising framework. And what's interesting is that the outcomes vary. Some are interested in sustainable development goals. Others are interested in well-being. Some are interested in environment in terms of a subset of SDGs and what they're prioritising. Others might be around gender equality in terms of a specific outcome within a greater number that the government is targeting. But it's highlighted the challenge of which aspects of or which measures from national statistics are actually helpful, what is the lag effect of that. And with it, while there's some integrity from using national statistics for a base, a political frustration of, yes, we won't see it for 3 years, and there's an election before then. And so it might be the most credible source of information to help organise and help assess the merits of a proposal, but it's just not timely relative to what needs to be communicated through a political event. Then we get to spending reviews, which seems to be the very fashionable topic at the moment. And what I was observing actually over lunch was the fact that it's such a generic term. Countries are undertaking so many different forms of spending reviews. We almost need some kind of new label above it or something beneath it to identify just what's actually happening. Is it a review of a whole organisation? Is it a policy program? Is it just what is this particular thing that's being reviewed? Say it's a political event as well, and I think that's fundamental in distinguishing it from an evaluation, because essentially it's saying to a minister, the outcome of this may well change the size and nature of your portfolio. And so if that's not political in terms of whether it gets support or not, then there's really hard to know what is in terms of what a minister thought he or she was signing up for. And so the governance and the way in which a spending review is led is really crucial in this. We see that basically every OECD country is undertaking spending reviews. Resource constraint exists. Constraint exists with an OECD country as much as it does another country, and looking into the base of expenditure is just as crucial. What's been interesting is to see how the use of spending reviews, though, has changed over the last 10 years. After the global financial crisis, we saw the evidence showed that spending reviews were predominantly used to identify savings. And where a government had a deficit resulting from the global financial crisis, then actually everyone rallying together across line ministries to take a cut of 5% or whatever that figure is to help restore national finances, that was an effective tool of doing it. As fiscal balances became stronger, those savings did not come through in the same way. As the countries got healthier fiscally, then saw that actually the preparedness of a permanent secretary, a chief executive of a ministry to give up money when they could see the national accounts were doing all right, that national contribution started to ease back. But it substituted itself, though, with, is the policy effective? Are there risks there around it? That may not be a saving this year, but there may be a nasty surprise for the government in a future year, and it's worth bringing that to the forefront now. Are there capacity constraints which were actually never really thought about too much at the time policy was put in place? It was just really an instruction to get on with it and show some results, and a chance to go back and look at that. In other cases, it's that a spending review reveals what's occurred post a merger of two ministries that really, at the time of organisational change, again, a great desire to show progress, but not necessarily address the fact that there were duplicate officers doing the same thing, or legacy computer systems, sometimes which will be expressed in legislation, and there'll be a cost structure there that's driven from dated legislation, and spending review as a way to help surface that. Really challenging process, and I think we've seen some very good examples of where external organisations have been helpful for critiquing what is effective as well. The one that comes to mind is the Global Fund for the Eradication of AIDS, HIV. That's the wave for 10 minutes. But the intervention logic for a specific purpose organisation like that provides very clear critique around the effectiveness of a program, and useful for being brought into spending reviews, particularly where they're targeted reviews. 2 minutes just to wind up. What? What's that? Sorry? And finally, yes, that brings me to. But no, very mindful of challenges around this, and the fact that spending reviews are difficult to undertake. It's hard enough for a Ministry of Finance to know what questions to ask, let alone think it's in a position to know what the answer is. Have been impressed by countries like Slovakia that have set up a value for money unit, in terms of that catchphrase this morning, to undertake a program of spending reviews. And are deliberately upskilling their own team before they think they can go out to line ministries to do that. Have seen the fact that when these programs, when these reviews occur for the first time, there can often be a work program of identifying, for example, oh, there's lots of gaps in performance information. Perhaps we can work on that. It wasn't actually a reason not to do the review. It just created a set of recommendations or set of actions to then put in place to go from it. So improvements that can occur that aren't necessarily financial, but do strengthen the system. With that, seeing an ever greater number of countries take them up. Even non-OECD countries. This is not meant to be for OECD countries as an observation, in the sense that I look at Thailand and how it's integrated into its budget cycle, and go, actually, that's well advanced beyond many OECD countries, where they'll conduct spending reviews but won't necessarily connect it to the budget. Maybe not intentionally, but sometimes the timing doesn't work, and then it loses momentum, or other reasons for just the events of life. And yet something that's very systematized in an example like Thailand. I should pause and not take up my colleagues' time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you very much. Now we're going to pass to Segai, who's going to talk about value for money in Ethiopia.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maya, and thank you, ODI, for inviting me to this event. So my talk is going to be based on our experience in supporting the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Health in conducting value for money analysis in the health sector. And also on a study that we did on fiscal equity in the country. So these two projects are one of many projects Fiscus is doing in Ethiopia, supporting different ministries. So like many other countries, sector ministries come up with their plans for the year, and then ask the Ministry of Finance for budget. The Ministry of Finance approve the budget, and then there is no connection, there is no talk. And then the Parliament are always asking the Ministry of Finance why a certain project was financed and why not another one? Why no airport in my village? Why no industrial park in my village? And the Ministry of Finance has no answer to these questions. So this kind of practice, like studying value for money in the different sectors, can help the Ministry of Finance answer some of the questions and also establish a relationship with the different sector ministries. And this value for money, we did not do it. The idea is to sort of guide people in the Ministry of Finance and in the sector ministries to do value for money analysis on their own. So we were just helping them to do that. Based on these two projects, the challenges of doing a value for money analysis or spending review, even in Europe, we heard it's very difficult. So you can imagine how difficult it is in a developing country context. So unless you come up with a very simple tool where experts and civil servants that can understand and do, then there is no point if it's a complicated value for money analysis. So this is very, very simple and intuitive. So they look at the spending, the inputs, the finance, and then the outputs. So in the health sector, it would be building health facilities, and then the outcomes. It could be maternal mortality or child mortality. So kind of in a very simple way to find a relationship between these three. So the challenges we faced in this exercise, I'm going to talk about those. One is lack of consistent budget or expenditure classification. So, of course, with a very complicated value for money analysis, maybe you don't need this. But if you want a simple value for money analysis, then you need to have a sort of consistent budget program. Whether budget program is good or not is debatable. But for the sort of simple value for money analysis, this would have made it very, very easy. Another problem we faced is, in a federal system like Ethiopia, where the regions have quite significant autonomy in spending, and also in collecting revenue. So what happens is every year the federal revenue is distributed to different regions in a block grant, and there is a formula based on population and other things. And actually, recently, the formula is based on expenditure need. And also revenue potential of the regions. Now you do an analysis, and then you come up with what proportion a certain region gets and what proportion other region gets. But the problem is, if it depends on the expenditure need, the regions have an incentive to underspend on sort of capital. So they tend to spend it in recurrent expenditures. So because they know next year they will get a higher sort of budget. So this kind of makes, even though you're really doing an analysis, actually there is sort of incentive problem with this one. Another thing is, there is a lot of decentralization in the country. It's a good thing, but there is variation in capacity in the different regions, even at federal level, let alone at the different administrative levels. So there is a problem in using data and analysis when doing budgets. There is no system of impact assessment in the country. So what we focus is on the outputs. So we built this number of health facilities, this number of schools, this number of universities, but there is no system of actually measuring the outcomes. It's very complicated, as you know. But now recently, the Planning and Development Commission are saying that they're going to start to sort of measuring outcomes rather than just outputs. But there is a significant capacity limitation. And in countries like Ethiopia, working for the ministries for civil service is not interesting, is not attractive. So all the good talent, they are going to NGOs or to multinational organizations. So that's going to be a big challenge. And there is difference in budget execution in the different regions. Even though with your analysis you come up, a certain region requires more budget, but then you see in the last year, even the budget they had, they didn't really use it. So it makes, even though it makes the use of analysis less relevant, unfortunately, because of this capacity problem. Another problem we sort of faced was the disconnect between the Ministry of Finance and the different ministries. So it was very difficult to bring the Ministry of Health on board at the beginning because they thought this aimed at cutting their budget. So, but later the relationship became more. They understood, and then one of the key results of this exercise was actually to sort of create this connection between Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Health. And we are also hoping to do the same with the Ministry of Education, and hopefully in the future, the Ministry of Finance and the different ministries will do this on their own. Another challenge is some of the things are politically decided, because a federal system like Ethiopia, it's very sensitive. For example, you have heard about the industrial parks in the country, and if you look at the map, the industrial parks are actually evenly distributed. So even though originally the idea of industrial parks was sort of economic feasibility, right? But then, because every region, wants this, some of the decision had to be made, not because it was economically feasible, but because there was a lot of political pressure. This is probably less problematic in countries which are homogeneous or more sort of centralized countries. So that was our experience.
Thank you very much, Sigai. And now Kenneth's going to talk to us about trying to make better use of analysis to influence budgetary decision-making.
Okay, thank you very much. Of course, as she said, my name is Kenneth Mugambe. I've been working as a director of budget for 7 years now. So I could really understand, especially the issues which came up in the morning. I would also like to thank ODI, because I think this topic is very relevant, because one of the things we are discussing back home is actually the whole essence of PFM. Because if you cannot have PFM, you're helping to impact on lives or improving service delivery, then you can as well not have, PFM. Of course, unfortunately, I'm not so sure that there is any substitute to PFM, systems and tools, because, whatever you do, to be able to, allocate resources and spend resources, you definitely need systems. So PFM systems, in our, the way we see it, is definitely a must. So I think the key question is, of course, as the topic we are discussing now, how best do we use, these PFM systems to guide, our allocation decisions, and that's really what I wanted to focus on. Of course, I was happy to hear from Mark. I don't know if Mark is still here. Yes. In the morning, he said that, they used to have this seminar here in the winter. Now they are going to have it in summer in May. I wanted to make a slight adjustment to his proposal and request that he brings it to Kampala, because I believe the summer in Kampala is better than the summer in London in May.
Excuse me, you're having difficulty hearing down at the back here, and I don't know if the microphones can be adjusted.
Okay, I'm not in control of the microphones. I don't know what will happen, but I'll try to shout as much as I can. So I was actually proposing that Mark instead makes an adjustment and we take the next seminar to Kampala in May rather than in London, because I believe the summer in Kampala is better than the summer in London. But anyway, back to the point. I'm going to highlight, I think, two cases essentially, where we have used the...
I think it's a little slow. Just press again, icon.
I don't know, maybe...
There's a slight lag. Just a slight lag.
No, maybe I need some assistance there. But anyway, maybe I could just speak, because I wanted to show...
Oh,
yeah, that's essentially what I wanted, to demonstrate some of the work that we do. In that particular case, we normally collect, household expenditure data using the Uganda Household Survey. And this we have done over a number of years, probably, over the last, 20 to 30 years. So using that information, we are able to disaggregate, the incidence of poverty, by, the lowest administrative unit, the district. And of course, as you can actually see, if you look at the two maps of Uganda, one shows, much darker shades of poverty, and then, of course, the most recent one, some slight, improvement. Of course, we have had a history of huge decline in poverty, although in the recent past we have seen some, slight increase. But essentially what we have done now is looking at that situation, and especially given the fact that there has been some slight increase in poverty, how do we help local governments, districts, particularly those ones which are facing, higher incidences of poverty, to get a bigger allocation of their resources. So we use that information now to try and influence the allocation formula. Just like my colleague from Ethiopia said, in terms of the resources which are from the central government to the local government. The second point I want to make, again, more or less using the same information, the same analysis, is using data to analyze the impact of not just the resources, but many other factors. Because what we have actually seen is that it's not just resources that matter in terms of creating the impact and also the outcomes in service delivery. We've looked at a situation where, especially in education and health, if you look at per capita expenditure, we have seen situations where local governments, ideally more or less at the same level of development, but one getting higher resources is actually does a lot worse actually than one which gets less resources for the same interventions in education and health. So what that has actually points out too is that in analyzing data you need to dig deep and find out what are those other complementary factors that are needed to be addressed if you are to improve not just the allocative efficiency, but of course ultimately the impact that you want to create. Now the bigger challenge that we normally see, which I think actually came up in the morning, is how you strike a balance between this technical analysis, because on the one hand, I mean, if you go back to the discussions in the morning, especially the question of a strong Minister of Finance versus a weak Minister of Finance, we are a strong Ministry of Finance because we believe that we need a strong Ministry of Finance to be able to coordinate and maybe have a leadership role in guiding these institutions. But the question, of course, is how do you manage the tension between the technical analysis that you have done and the political considerations? I think a good point again was made in the morning. In most cases, politicians do not care about what happens in the long run. Okay, of course, in any case, in the long run, we are all dead anyway. So they don't know what will happen. He's there for he's short term by nature because he's looking at the next election, which is 3-5 years. So he doesn't care what will happen to the literacy rate, what will happen to even infant mortality rate in the long run. So what he minds about actually is what are the outputs, the physical outputs I'm actually going to deliver. How many schools am I going to build? Irrespective of whether the schools actually have teachers or even they are delivering education, or even whether the people are actually present in those schools. How many health facilities am I actually going to construct? Whether the health facilities, have medical workers or not, the politician doesn't mind. Just like one of my ministers said, for him what matters is actually creating some sense of hope for the population. Because he knows, especially in our setup, once the population see a school, whether actually their children are going to the school or not, so for them they have hope. So they will hope that actually, because you will not actually go and explain to them that yes, so many children now, have this, can read and write. No, what matters is actually that he has constructed a school. So as we do the technical analysis, as we do, using all this data, I think the key question is, how do we actually manage to bridge that gap between the information that we have, particularly we technocrats, and how we use that information to influence the thinking of the politicians. Now, in our situation, we believe that there is absolutely no substitute for that, as I said, because you need that kind of a level of, technical analysis to be able to make a case that actually what matters is not necessarily the number of, schools you are constructing, but of probably the quality, of those schools. Not the number of, health units you have actually constructed in particular localities, but the functionality, of those health, institutions. And you can actually do that, only if you have, information and the, technical, you have done the technical analysis. Now, maybe the other point I want to talk about is the extent to which we are able to do that. Because to be able to have that kind of analysis done in our setup, one of the key constraints normally is actually the availability of the data itself. And to what extent do you have that data and actually it is, not just accurate, but actually you can consistently generate that over a period of time so that you are able to demonstrate and, track, changes that are happening. Because once you don't have that strong data capacity, then you definitely will not be able to make a case to the politicians. And of course, related to that is the capacity itself, actually, to be able to analyze the data, both in the ministries of finance, but also in the line ministries. Because I think at the end of the day, what matters is, having some kind of convergence of thinking. Okay, in the morning, there was this discussion about planning and budgeting. Planning and budgeting are definitely two sides of the same coin. In my opinion, you must ensure that planning and budgeting are intertwined. Okay, but how do you ensure that planning and budgeting are done? You can only do that, by having the capacities both in the Ministry of Finance, but also being able to engage the line ministries, and also probably try to create capacities in the line ministries, so that you make a case, and you have people who can buy into your case, so that you have a common understanding, of what the priorities are, and also where the resources should be going. So once that is not done, then you have a huge challenge. Of course, maybe to make my last point, in Uganda, again, there was a discussion in the morning about some of these new initiatives like PBB. So what we've done is again to use this information to make a strong case for program-based budgeting. Because again, looking at the impact, because what we've seen is in the past, when we focused on outputs, we kind of neglected the impact or, the outcomes that I expected to, result from the resources we are spending. So we are now using the information that we have generated to make a strong case for program-based budgeting. Because we know if you're talking of, say, human capital development, it is not just the Minister of Education which is going to deliver human capital development. If you're talking about, nutrition or sanitation, it is not just one single ministry, but it's a combination of interventions, of various ministries. So using, that information, we are able to make a case, for program-based budgeting. We have actually been able to, of course, at an infant stage, but we have been able to identify a number of programs, okay? And working with the National Planning Commission, the National Planning Authority, we have been able to identify all these programs which cut across the institutions. So going forward, what we are doing now is to try and identify, the interventions under each of these programs. And then, of course, link the interventions under these programs to the administrative units. And then be able to assign, management responsibilities, like somebody talked about it this morning. Identify managers under each of these sub-programs or, specific areas of intervention. And then, of course, demand results from these, program managers. So we believe that by doing that, then we can actually show a link between the interventions which these ministries are doing, and then, of course, the outcomes or the impact that we want to create at the end of the day. I think I would stop at that, and I think she was generous, actually. I have been peeping, looking at her clock. So let me stop at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kenny. And now I'll pass to Paolo. And can I remind you all to please tweet if you have something interesting or controversial to say with hashtag public finance. Thanks. Paolo.
Right, thank you. I have to confess, over lunch break, I was pretty much regretting my decision to accept the conference organizer's invitation to step in for Fiona. I guess for a couple of reasons. One is that, of course, I had very little time to organize my thoughts. But second, also because it's difficult to be a discussant when you don't really know what you're going to discuss. Because basically these were, presentations based on recent experiences, personal reflections, not necessarily on papers, documents that I could review in advance. Having said this, I've prepared a few things which I think actually, provide hopefully some interesting points for reflection, which are definitely based on some of the things that I've heard from the previous speakers. In my view, I think it's quite clear, and it's probably clear to most of the people in the room, that this idea of using analysis to inform budget allocation is a very difficult proposition for a number of reasons. Incentives, generally speaking, are sort of stacked against the use of analysis for allocation decisions, or more generally about evidence-based policymaking, if you wish. We've heard about the role that politicians play and how they basically, I was going to say something rude, but they basically mess up, let's say, the role that technocrat, that they ignore the analysis, they ignore the evidence, they use different criteria for taking decisions about where the money should be spent. They worry about easily, visible outputs that they can plant their flags on, rather than thinking about, the long-term sustainability, service delivery, and outcome and results indicators. There's probably something related to the role that bureaucrats play as well. The fact that if the classic Niskanen bureau maximizing bureaucrat, knows that if I put all of my eggs into recurrent spending, then next year I'm likely to get a slightly higher allocation. That, of course, goes against all kinds of rational criteria for having the best impact, but they respond to the incentives that bureaucrats respond to. We've heard also this morning about how, for example, donors take decisions about where to allocate their own resources, which often are delinked from government's own priority setting mechanisms, government's own policy formulation processes and objectives, and so on. We know that budgets are very rigid across a number of countries. You have to pay your salaries, you have to pay off your debt. You have lots of transfers that are based on legal entitlements. So at the end of the day, your space for reallocation is usually a very small percentage of your overall budget, therefore leaving you with having to have analysis that in the end sort of impinges on a very small percentage of the overall budget. And we could go on and make the list a lot longer in terms of how difficult it is to approach budget allocation processes and decisions from a rational perspective and using evidence analysis to support those decisions. Having said this, I think there's a few principles and ideas, or at least points for reflection that I would like to leave here on the table for us to discuss. First of all, we need to ask ourselves what kind of analysis can help. So it's not necessarily a point of collecting as much data as possible, or providing very sophisticated models that can tell us lots of things. We should really be able, especially in resource-constrained and capacity-constrained environments, focusing on what do we want out of the analysis, or what can the analysis tell us that can help us in the decision-making process. We spoke a lot about efficiency and effectiveness. I was happy that Andrew also mentioned a number of other things that governments want to try and pursue. Think about gender equality, think about SDGs, think about human rights. There's lots of different things that can come into this picture that can help us decide about what are the kinds of analysis that might be particularly useful to inform decisions around resource allocation, for example. Where there are the greatest gaps that government is supposed to fill vis-a-vis different types of objectives that it wants to achieve. Second question is, who is best placed to do the analysis? Who has the access to the relevant information? Who has the access to the needed capacity? This issue of whether, I think it's quite interesting to think about whether the analysis function should be something that is, all of us or the previous speakers have kind of assumed is something that the Ministry of Finance should do. But there's probably lots of analysis that really belongs to the sectors themselves, and that they can carry out more effectively with better access to information. And I'm wondering whether there's aspects about how the budget system is organized that might affect where the right place for carrying out the analysis really makes sense. So, for example, if you have a bottom-up budgeting process where line ministries are basically allowed to submit proposals that are as big as they want, then of course the analysis function is pushed to the Ministry of Finance, because they need to challenge these submissions and they need to enter into a dialogue with line ministries about how they need to prioritize, what they need to prioritize, where do they need to allocate resources, and where they need to reduce their proposals. If you have, on the other hand, sort of a top-down budgeting process, then to some extent the Minister of Finance can push that responsibility back to the line ministries, because it gives them a ceiling, and then it says, okay, you have to stay within that ceiling, and now it's your job to sort of tell me about how you set your priorities, how you make your choices, and what kind of evidence you use to back up those choices. Third and final point, in my view, is the actually second last point. So to me, the biggest issue, and I think we've heard it repeatedly, is how do we shift the incentives around the use of evidence and analysis to inform resource allocation, and what does it mean to educate politicians in Uganda, for example, or what does it mean to think about coming to a more evidence-based policy-making process that allows government to decide about alternative uses of resources, either across sectors or within sectors. And I think here, yes, the Minister of Finance plays a huge role in terms of constructing a database narrative that can convince politicians to act differently, as difficult as that is across a number of countries. The other way of possibly doing this is to sort of, for the Minister of Finance to sort of help or think about coalitions for change. And here sort of I bring a little bit of the work that we do at the International Budget Partnership in terms of promoting change in country budget processes that are based on civil society and citizens' needs and priorities, trying to argue for different resource allocations that are different from what the government has and that politicians support, but and bringing evidence to bear to try and convince politicians to do things differently. And sometimes civil society can do the analysis. People external to government can do the analysis. It doesn't always have to be the Minister of Finance or people within government. So analysis and evidence can come from outside as well. It can be used not just within government. It can be used within parliaments, for example. It can come from audit institutions. So I think we also need to go beyond this issue of ministries of finance and line ministries and what kind of analysis and who does the analysis that can inform budget allocation processes, and think more about the whole ecosystem that exists around the budget process and how better transparency, better accountability can lead to a differently structured debate around what the priorities are and why governments should change their priorities based on this evidence and based on pressure that may come from different places outside government. And in many ways, this can be something that the Ministry of Finance can then use internally to sort of try and shift existing incentives. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paolo, and thanks very much to all of our panel. So we've got a challenge there from Paolo to think more specifically about what tools we're actually talking about here in terms of what pieces of analytical work, who is doing it, how is it being used, and how is it being challenged against each other. Maybe more than one group is doing analysis and that interacts in some way. So I think it'd be good to, in our questions and our discussion, to try and get really concrete about the kind of tools that we're talking about and how they can be used as part of a much wider process. So let's move to questions. Anybody have any questions? Yes, and then. I'm not sure the microphone is on.
I'll just speak up. Mike Beasley from the World Bank. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I just wanted to ask the panel perhaps to reflect on the role of evaluation as an analytical tool. I've seen interesting examples of processes of ex ante evaluation of spending proposals. For example, in Chile, where all new programs have to be evaluated by the government, and performance indicators and things like that are considered, and net present value and all that kind of thing. And then ex post evaluation, which is another important analytical tool, but often seems to be not really taken very seriously for various reasons. So your reflections on that.
I think Andrew, and then
Good afternoon. I promise I won't speak at every single session, but I'll take this opportunity now. Segai and I worked together on this health value for money exercise. And one of the problems we had in coming up with recommendations was that most of the recommendations we could make were about spending more money. And it was actually quite difficult, or indeed transferring allocations from one thing to another. But it was very difficult to make recommendations linked to outputs or to outcomes. So, for example, one of the major problems in Ethiopia is that some regions spend 8% of their resources on health, others spend 16%. And not surprisingly, the regions spending 8% have very bad health outcomes. So there is a very close correlation, and not just at the top end, bottom ends, but across the spectrum between how much is spent and the nature of outcomes. So intuitively, it makes sense to promote higher spending in the less advantaged regions. But then we have two problems. Firstly, those same regions have poor budget execution ratios. So the second recommendation we made was that there should be a task force of the Ministry of Finance to provide training and support to those regions so that budget execution, in particular the investment budget, could be improved. But I'm not really sure that the Ministry of Finance has the capability to run that task force. So I'm not even sure that recommendation can run. But the other problem we came up with, which was from all the health specialists, they would say to us, oh, this is great, Andrew, more money, but more money doesn't mean better healthcare. Can't you have a more targeted recommendation that would focus on specific health programs or specific health outcomes? And the problem there is basically a data one, that one doesn't have annual data which you could use to monitor programs, or at least not from existing survey data. You would need to have new surveys in order to generate the new data on outputs or outcomes. And I noticed, Kenneth, that your local government formulae seem to allocate more money to the poorer regions in relation to poverty-related indices, but again, they're not targeting particular types of outputs or outcomes. So I guess my question is whether there is wider experience within OECD or other countries, from other people here, of targeting spending more precisely on outputs or outcomes and getting better results with it. Or whether actually, in the short term, what we're recommending is the best we can do. I'd be interested to hear.
Standing up at the back.
Thanks very much. Sorry, a second question from me. Related to the question of the use of analysis in sort of discussion about public finance, it seems to be that the analysis needs to be based on data. And my question is around how do you go about getting the data you need for your analysis? And I'm particularly thinking about the use of new technology. So one of the things that's changed in my working lifetime is that everyone has one of these. He holds up his mobile phone. I'm aware of, for example, during the Ebola crisis in West Africa, I think their American company called Geopol was brought in to do phone-based market research, polling of people all over Sierra Leone and around that region, to find out, had people received a visit from a clinician, had they received a vaccine. They used the feedback from people's phones to allocate the resources. Obviously, that's in an emergency situation. So my question is about, are you using this type of technology, or should you be using this type of technology, and how best to sort of harness technology and potentially the role of the private sector in providing you with the data that you need to manage public finance better?
Thank you. And the lady here.
Hi, thanks a lot for the excellent presentation. I'm Yulia Dimitri with the PFAS Secretariat. And I have a couple of questions for Tsegai. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. So I'm very much interested to know about the value for money analysis or assessment that was conducted in Ethiopia. First, how much resource intense those analyses are, and how long do they take to be conducted? Considering the challenges in Ethiopia, I've been there, so I know how difficult it is to get things done there. And what are the modalities of conducting those analyses? So are those conducted externally or internally by the government officials? And my last question is, I would be curious to know how they were received, the recommendations and the findings. Andrew mentioned the challenges when it comes to how to come up with specific, recommendation. So how well they were received by the government and the extent to which they informed the resource allocation. And as I'm here, I was wondering if I can take 1 minute to introduce a module that the PFAS Secretariat has developed and focus particularly on the subnational government PFAS assessment and the service delivery. So we have revised the subnational government framework, and as part of it, we have introduced the service delivery module. And the inspiration, PFAS service delivery, so there is quite, a long way. And the inspiration was actually when we were in Ethiopia to conduct a PFAS assessment training. The main focus of the government and the development partner there was we are conducting 7 PFA assessments at the subnational level, how we can use the PFA findings and the PFA assessment and the subnational government PFM performance to identify bottlenecks in service delivery. Our initial thinking when we started working on it was if we could come with a set of indicators, PFI-like indicators and dimensions, which would help us to assess the extent to which the performance of the PFM system at the subnational level impact the service delivery. But the main challenges to come with those indicators was that you have completely different service delivery arrangements, the funding. So to put all that country context and the service delivery arrangements in a standardized PFI indicators was quite challenging. So that's why we came up with a set of diagnostic questions around the PFA framework, and I'll finish. And the framework document, along with the service delivery module, is out for public consultation. And I really invite you all to have a look at the PFA website and provide your comments and suggestions, considering your experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And just one last question, then we'll go to the panel.
Hello, I'm Duncan Cook. I head the analytical team that does resource allocation for local government in England. I'm interested in the point about schools and hope. It reminds me of bin collection in the UK, and also interested in the spread of your investment parks as a result of political intervention. We have the opposite in England. We also get around the incentive problem by not committing to any future policy, which is a little hag that you could do. Love all the outcome stuff, and we're also only just getting around to it. But I'm interested in the role of analysis in your countries, where you're perhaps using it to help illustrate trade-offs between central control and local choice, where perhaps you get to understand the mechanism by which money turns into a thing that you want. But then how does money and allocating resources in different areas help you figure out what politically you want, where it might be a balance between control centrally and choice locally?
Thank you very much. Right, we'll just go to the panel. So
Just one more.
there'll be another round in a
another
moment.
round?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So go ahead, Andrew, if you want to answer any of those questions.
Perhaps starting with Ivor's one on evaluation, going back to the beginning, and essentially agreeing with him to say how valuable ex ante evaluation in particular is for setting expectations, because so often when policy is implemented, the goalposts move once there's a greater sense of awareness of what's going to be achieved or not be achieved, where some ex-ante evaluation helps establish some boundaries around what was actually going to be delivered at the beginning. And with ex post, I think one of the observations has been how often it can occur too quickly or too soon before benefits are fully achieved, and it brings out the fact that many policies upon implementation don't actually have a benefit realisation plan or some way of understanding how those benefits are going to accrue over time. A bit like how I said spending reviews, I thought was an overused term for a number of variations within that basket. Ivor, I'm left wondering whether evaluation's an overused term too, because I kind of have respect for it as a professional discipline, and for the social scientists out there who have studied, have completed a degree in it, and we tend to think of evaluation as something that can be that form of exercise with all of the integrity it contains. And then there's a whole lot of other kinds of activities that are called evaluation too, but mainly may not reach that standard. I think that the challenge I have with ex post evaluation is, when was a policy decision made based on an evaluation? And just how difficult we talk about the difficulty of connecting decisions to the budget process. It seems very hard to connect evaluations to policy decisions as well.
Yeah, just to briefly comment on some of the questions about evaluation ex ante. The different agencies in Ethiopia, they have some sort of ad hoc system of doing feasibility study, but it's not widely disseminated, so people don't really know. So because of that, there is perception of inequality, the sort of sensitivity in a federal system like Ethiopia. So one of our recommendations from the fiscal equity study was actually whether they have a system of ex-ante evaluation or not, you need to go and ask them. Then maybe they can find and tell you, oh yes, we have done this sort of study. But without going, you will never get it. Ex-post evaluation, no. There isn't. For some of the big programs like the the safety net program we had in rural areas, now also we are starting urban areas, then some donors, they do, because I think they are expected to do so. But government doesn't really do. And this value for money study is kind of a first step towards that as well. The question for Andrew, I think I am not in a position to comment on that, but thanks for enriching the speech. But I think some people will comment on that. About how we get our data, so Ministry of Finance, we have this IBEX, Integrated Budget and Expenditure System, where Channel 1 and Channel 2 data are collected. So Channel 1 is budget data managed by the Ministry of Finance and the regional counterparts. So it comes from the tax revenue or from budget support from donors. And we have the Channel 2, where donors give to the ministry directly, and the ministry and the regional bureaus implement. This Channel 1 and Channel 2 go through the IBEX system. For the Channel 3, it's directly managed by NGOs, and there is no way of really accounting this when government is doing budget and expenditure. So this is actually one of the challenges, because there is resource duplication, NGO building a clinic, and then the government is supposed to do the recurrent expenditure, but there is always mismatch in this. But in general, yeah, we use the Ministry of Finance data from the IBEX. We also, for the health, we also use DHS for the outputs and outcomes. We also use some household surveys in the country. So these days, the household surveys, DHS, they are done using the copy. So there is they are filling the data in real time. So there is a bit of technology being used in the country, in the survey, and also in the Ministry of Finance. Julia's, was it Julia? Yeah. For our experience for the value for money for health, because it was really requested by the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Finance was very supportive of when we want data and stuff like that. So it wasn't much resource intensive. And it took longer than we thought, because the people in the Ministry of Finance had also other assignments. So sometimes, the IMF would have a meeting for a week, and then so we would have to wait until they have time. So because we didn't do it ourselves, we were just giving guidance. So this was really, even though we helped them, you can say it was internally done by the Ministry of Finance. In terms of how it was received, whether it was used in the budget, there was some time inconsistency there. But the study we did on the fiscal equity, because there was this perception of inequity in the country, despite actually the government giving too much weight for equity, like the industrial parks and the universities being built in a remote areas, because every region wanted a university in their area, even though going to university is based on lottery basis. So even if you are born in the north, it's possible that you go to a university in the south. So it doesn't really matter where the university is located. But because of this pressure from government is forced to build university in a very, very remote area. In the parliament, the prime minister, when he was giving his report for the 2011 Ethiopian calendar, the parliamentarians were asking, why don't you build a railway in our village? Why not? There is no industrial park in our area. Those things. So I think our analysis through the Ministry of Finance on the fiscal equity actually gave them confidence to tell the parliamentarians, we are doing this study, and then that there is equity is being given a lot of weight. So somehow I think it kind of helped in that. But in the resource allocation, probably in the future, I think it will be taken into consideration. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Kenneth?
Okay, now on the issue of evaluation, in the recent past in Uganda, we have started streamlining our public investment management system, and actually picking from examples like Chile. So we are looking at a situation where we have defined a number of steps. For example, a project must go through, and at each step, of course, there are a number of things you are expected, to do before you can, move on the project the next step. So we think actually there is a strong case, for ex ante, either in terms of feasibility studies, to be able to make a case for a particular project, and of course even ex post. Actually, we have done one exercise on universal primary education. And the findings were actually quite revealing in terms of the constraints and in terms of what needs to be changed moving forward to the next stage. I think the key question is one of the extent to which you are able to undertake those processes in terms of the effectiveness, but also in terms of the timeliness of the exercise, because again going back to the issue of the politicians. They want to see a project actually moving extremely fast. Okay, so if you are going to subject a project to so many different stages and processes as we are doing, they tend to lose patience. So they want to see a project done. Once they have made a political decision, they want to see a project moving and then going into implementation. But of course, on our side, we think there's a strong case for that. Now, Andrew did talk about this exercise you did, the value for money exercise in Ethiopia. I think the key challenge I would have with that is, of course, the exercise per se is good, but I mean, if you come up with more and more money, additionality, from our experience, what we actually see is the moment you engage in every single intervention, requires additional resources. So once the issue becomes more and more additional resources, they tend to negate actually the issues of improved efficiency, issues actually of value for money themselves. There's no single line in ministry that does not want to advocate for additional resources. My colleagues are here. I mean, if you ask them when we are discussing the budget, for every single intervention, they want additional resources. So if, the fiscal space is limited, and every single intervention wants additional resources, then how will you be able to achieve, that value for money actually you are talking about? How will you be able to achieve efficiency, in the spending you are talking about? Because every single institution will come up actually with additional demands, demands for additional resources. Now, on the issue of, again, the issue you talked about, how we use these variables. Yes, we use poverty because we believe that at some point, anyway, you need a minimum level of funding to be able to deliver, some minimum services. So that's why we are really looking at poverty, because if you're a poorer district, you have a lot of constraints. So there's some minimum level of allocations that you need. But also what we realize is that some of the variables actually were favoring, richer districts. Now, if you take the example of education, capitation grant, one of the key variables we used to allocate capitation grant was actually the number of children in school. Okay? So meaning, if you are a local government, a district, which has more children, and probably you're actually richer, you will actually get more money. But if you're a local government which has less children, because probably those children have not gone to school, then naturally you actually get less money. So the question would be, when will those children actually who are already disadvantaged, be able to go to school? Because they might be actually school-age going children, but they are actually not going to school. So if you simply look at the number of children in school for a particular district, so if one district has, 100,000, maybe because they have 90%, of the children going to school, yet there's another district which has maybe 50,000, and yet they have like 40,000 not in school but of school going age, then definitely you are disadvantaging the poorer district. So we tend to look at all those different variables and see how to strike a balance. Now on the issue of the tools, I think on the one hand you are talking about the monitoring tools, and then of course the tools which you use to generate data that then you use in enhancing your analytical capacity. Now in terms of monitoring, I mean you have to look at a country-specific situation. Of course, a mobile phone now is something which is, available probably across, even the remotest villages in our countries. But there are some things you cannot use, for example, in our system. If you want to do like a clocking in system, for example, a biometric system, to be able to track teacher and pupil absenteeism, I'm sure it can be done here in London. It cannot, but I don't know to what extent it can be done in Uganda, where only 22% of the population have access to electricity. So even if you are to invest in solar energy or whatever, the question is, do you actually have those resources? First of all, to be able to invest in those systems, simply to use the systems to track, the student attendance or teacher attendance. So you really have to look at the systems which can apply, to different situations. But in terms of course, the data, like I said, in our case, we do generate household survey data, of course, through surveys, and also the administrative data, actually, which is generated by the ministries. So we look at, a combination of all that information to be able to analyze and look at the trends and see, to make some policy decisions and, cases out of that data. Yes.
Thank you, Kenneth. And Paolo?
Yeah. Just a couple of very, very quick points. One on ex post evaluation. And I mean, to some extent, we can think that in many ways, many countries already have an ex post evaluation system in place, and that's called external audit. We can say everything we can about, there's lots of things to say about the quality of external audit, about the coverage of external audit, about the extent to which it covers performance rather than not. But, I think there's something to be said about building existing institutions rather than creating new ones that might duplicate functions. And I think there's actually a lot of, even in countries where external audit function doesn't function amazingly well, I think it still is an underexploited source of information, an underexploited source of a mechanism for accountability that could be used much better. This is just an observation, sort of building on your point, with which I agree. And then the only other point is on the use of technology, use of mobile phones. There's some interesting stuff going on. If you think about participatory budgeting at the local level around the world, there's an increasing use of online voting mechanisms, online project submission mechanisms that involve, you're able to basically scale up the level of citizen participation in the decision-making process around resource allocation through apps and mobile phones. So that's definitely an area where there's been a lot of movement. Clearly, there's also a lot of stuff that happens in terms of citizens complaining about some service delivery issue, whether it's potholes on the street or problems with garbage collection, etc. And that, of course, provides information that the government can immediately use to allocate resources to solving a specific problem. The question there, of course, is usually one about scope and scale. Basically, it's fine to you can easily think about ways to use new technologies and mobile phones for something that is local. And something that is, sort of very specific to that can generate a direct intervention. But of course, it becomes a lot more difficult when you're thinking about, big budgetary choices about whether you should spend more on health or education or defense or whatever else, or how much debt the government should go into. There are some interesting initial things going on. Half a minute, about using budget simulators to sort of run online surveys, citizen surveys about some of these bigger issues. It's very much incipient, and it's still kind of being tested. But I definitely agree with you that there's a lot of scope for looking into that as a possible area of future intervention that might provide very useful data for resource allocation purposes.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for another round of questions if everyone is brief. And I'd also particularly like to hear any sector ministry perspectives if that's possible. Yes, go ahead.
Beatrice Muganda from the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research. I think there's something missing from this conversation, and this is the role of universities. At least back home in Africa, this is the reservoir for all the tools and knowledge, and they have often complained that they have been ignored. And we are saying that the education coming out of these universities is not relevant. This is really an opportunity to give them to deal with real life issues, data, and make a contribution and produce the kind of students who really will come and take your positions and do a good job. Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am called Derek Namisi. I have heard a lot since morning about education and health sectors. I am from Uganda, and I work in the education sector, particularly in the budget office. So most of what is said touches me directly, and I have a lot of experience in what takes place, but I will be brief. I think my comments will come more tomorrow in the issue of technologies and using finance to work for service delivery. The education sector in Uganda, the outcomes are not the best. And when it comes to the funding, naturally we shall be like Oliver Twist, always asking for more. But I would like to relate my experience to what the director says. As we look at more funding for the education sector, we look more at the issue of what is efficient and what is effective in the shortest run as we try to ask for money, because you have to look at the economy as well. Money is not readily available. The best way to allocate would be looking at the spending efficiency, but the spending requirements. But the money is never readily available. So you look at how to get the money and spend it and have outcomes within the shortest time. So as we talk about all this, we need to look at the issue of efficiency. Data is the best to use in evidence-based allocation. But you'll find, if you come to Uganda, you find that the data is not always readily available. You do not have data immediately. You would need data immediately. You would need to have data on school attendance, performance, infant mortality, absence. You need all that data in the shortest time. But one, it's very expensive. Two, it is hard to access in the shortest time possible. So as we discuss, I would feel that we also need to look at the issue of efficiency, what works in the shortest way and what is cheap. We know the best way is to have data readily available, but it's expensive. And lastly, before I sign off, we need to also discuss the issue of incentivized allocations. Most of the money looks like it's going into a black hole within our public sector. We need to discuss the issue of using performance to inform allocations. The schools which perform best, the hospitals which improve on service delivery should be seen to be given some sort of carrot to encourage allocation as we do the analysis. So as the education sector, we are looking at the issue of incentivized allocations. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Ms. Ratham.
Thank you. I just wanted to contribute to this discussion in two respects. One, to take on what you said about audit as a source of ex-post valuation. But so what we have done, I've worked with the CAG, our Control and Auditor General, on this, is they've started doing value for money audits. And there are two stages to that. So first they do a scan and they say, okay, if something did not work, if it did work, well, nothing ever works. But if it did work, then you sort of leave it alone. But if it did not work, was that because there was a policy error or a design problem? If it was either of these two, then that triggers a full value for money audit. If, however, they find it was a standard PFM problem, it actually moves out to the division. And the division says, this is not a value for money issue. This is a corruption issue. This is an incompetence issue, something. And it goes to the regular audit people who then check, how many liters of petrol you spent. I think that's a very good way to do it. But, taking on from your point, ma'am, it would not have happened if we did not have civil society and the universities doing value for money investigations and a media that was highlighting the value for money problem. Now, this is not going to happen automatically because no government likes universities. One reason, ma'am, I think our universities don't work properly is governments don't like them to work properly. They're sources of insurrection and governments have got used to getting rid of them. Students are terrible things to have around it. These are quasi-autocratic governments at most. So I don't think we're going to have universities, but it is possible to have, therefore, civil society spaces. The second point I wanted to make was an experiment I'm doing in India, which may be of interest, which is now we have to cut the budget. I mean, we have to reduce expenditure, at least as a percentage of GDP. So you're not even talking about increasing expenditure. So one test, I don't know whether the ministry will take it, I've put forward is this. I'm calling it politely resilience. That, okay, I have a bunch of spending programs, and so far we've been discussing what you'll do with extra money. I'm going to cut your budget. How resilient is your program in terms of outcomes to my budget cut?
Thank you. Any final question? Yes, there's someone right at the back. Red hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Oliver. Sorry. I'm Oliver Fiala from Save the Children. I just wanted to follow up on the equity issue, which was already mentioned in the example of Ethiopia. And I wanted to hear what you think, for example, incidence analysis could play a role, not focusing only how, for example, poor communities benefit from certain services and therefore budget allocations, but also looking at different ethnicities or age groups and how that could be implemented into a more equitable allocation of resources. Just to add one comment, really brief one. We're looking at the moment at Save the Children to expand our work in that area. There's a post until Sunday open, so if you know anyone interested in PFM or you're interested yourself, please have a look. Thank you.
All right, we've had a couple of plugs this session. Maybe we'll say no more plugs, please. Right, we've had one question online for Kenneth, who says, the question is, what role did analysis and the Ministry of Finance play in Uganda's decision to implement universal secondary education through public-private partnerships, and what role did it play in the decision to end the partnerships? So we're just at the very end, so we've got 1 minute for everybody to answer whichever questions they like and any final remarks. But Andrew.
Okay. Very quickly, just a shout out to support the call about connection to universities, and to say that within our own work at the OECD on budgeting, we have a Schools of Government network in terms of reflecting the importance of that. At a practical level, would just to illustrate the point, would say, as a fellow budget director like Kenneth, the number of people who we employ who have only experienced the upside of an economic cycle, when for many OECD countries it is the longest economic cycle since the global financial crisis, that universities are a wonderful source of institutional knowledge and memory around what the labour market doesn't necessarily provide in a particular time. And so there are lots of other examples, but so many points of value that access from a university can assist with. Thank you.
Yeah, the three speakers, I think it was more of a comment and kind of accepted. Olivier specifically asked me about the equity consideration in the Ethiopian case. There is a lot of consideration to rural, urban, gender, and also the regions are divided into developing regions and the other regions. So usually this is taken into account, especially at federal level. So the developing regions, which are mostly pastoralist regions, they get special attention. However, since regions have autonomy, it's up to them. For example, how much to allocate, as Andrew was saying, how much to allocate for education, for health. You cannot really force them because it's the arrangement, the power. But of course, you can suggest, you can train them, and then influence their sort of allocation. But we also have this block grant is just given to them, and then it's up to them to allocate it. But we also have this specific grant where it sort of takes into account the shortcomings in each region, and then the Ministry of Finance has guidelines as to how they can spend this special grant.
Thank you. And Kenneth?
Okay, I think the specific question on universal primary education. Universal primary education, just like many policies, cannot just be simply a decision based on technical analysis. In most cases, there is a political decision, and what I think is important is for the technical, analysis to back up, or at least to help in the form and what form maybe that political decision is implemented, to ensure that you avoid the wastage of resources. And I think in the case of Uganda, that's exactly what happened. So there was a political decision to implement universal primary education, but also there were a number of studies actually which we did when we did our poverty eradication action plan, which actually pointed out the need to have universal primary education. The issue, of course, was the form and that it took actually during implementation. I think there was something else I wanted to comment on. The issue of universities. We believe that there is actually a strong role for universities. Maybe the question also is whether universities are able to reclaim that space and actually fill in the gap. Of course, in our countries, most of the policies are actually not researched. So we believe actually there is actually a space for universities to be able to influence policies and also undertake the evaluation whether ex ante or ex post that was being talked about. In fact, one of the things we are doing now under our public investment management system is actually to partner with Makerere University to be able to create capacity in PIMS, in the public investment management system, so that we are able to produce graduates who appreciate the policies, the issues, but also actually to be able to have capacity themselves actually, for example, to participate in feasibility studies and also in the ex post evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Paul?
I will give up my minute for the sake of coffee.
Oh, wow. Well, thanks to Paolo's selfless sacrifice. We are only 2 minutes over time. I'm an academic, and this is a huge success in our world. So, I'm going to break the rule and make a final plug. So we have 3 plugs. The final plug is the last session, which is at 4 o'clock, which is getting money where it is needed when it is needed. So please enjoy your coffee, and please thank the panel speakers again. Thank you.